All right, we have Olivier that's going to be joining in one moment. So Olivier is VP of Product Development at Lingoport, French-born software developer. Bonjour Olivier, ça va bien?
Bonjour.
Excellent. So basically what we're going to be looking at today is a presentation, continuous software localization, transformative approach. I'm sure it's going to be very, very insightful, and obviously there's going to be a lot of takeaways that you guys can have from the presentation. Please remember, you can ask your questions in the QA section, and we'll get to them towards the end. Olivier, I'll pop back in towards the end of your presentation just to show you a time cue, as well as take the questions and convey those to you. Sound good?
Perfect. Thank you so much, Brian, and thanks for organizing this. I'm amazed at how well this conference is going, and all the presenters that you've been able to put together. It's pretty amazing.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for that.
Yeah, the team has been actually very, very impressive, and I don't know how they did it in 4 weeks, but they managed to put everything together. It was unbelievable. And thank you to you for being here. Merci bien, j'apprécie beaucoup. All right, I'll pass you the mic now.
Let me know if you see my screen and if you see the agenda.
I can indeed. We can.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Right. Thank you. So pretty much this is all about software and software localization here. And this agenda with some rhyming Sean at the end here is going to go over software development notion and pretty much what software developers are all about, and how that translates or does not translate into good localization. What are resource files, a basic intro, and then the real meat is going to be around software development and localization here, especially the notion of automation around the translation process. I'm even going to attempt to do a demonstration of what I mean with the concepts that we're going to illustrate here with something that Bryan talked about in the previous panel actually was collaboration, and I want to touch just a little bit about this. I think it's something that we've been interested in for a while actually at Lingoport, and how that translates for us into products or into processes is kind of interesting, and a little conclusion on this. So first thing is I've worked in a lot of different industries before as a software developer, an architect, a senior architect, a principal engineer. I've been developing Unix systems and e-business system, GIS systems, scientific data analysis. And in the last 9 years with Lingoport, I've been doing something around localization. I'm saying that because in all the previous roles that I've held, my focus was not at all on localization. Even though I worked in Norway, in Switzerland, in France, and in the US, my focus was on designing good applications. And by that, it was applications that had good features, that were easy to use, that were functionally pleasing, that were of high quality. At HP, there was something called FERPs, for those who remember those terms, but really not localization. And so the software engineering world is very different from the world of localization at large, I must say. The major tasks for a software dev is pretty much designing, and what that means for us is we got a requirement, and that requirement is all about, you need to do a checkout, or you need to do a new business site, or you need to do this. And so it's going to be, how can we do this given an architecture that exists, or that we have to design for that matter, in terms of UI kind of validation, error checking, and so on. And that, how is that going to fit into a platform, if you will? That's the design. Then you code, and that's typically what people think about software devs is they write code. And part of that cycle is really code, test, rewrite the code, debug, and that's done in a set of environments that are kind of those environments. And again, I want to emphasize that because it's so different from localization. IDEs are where software devs write code, and when they write code, they write it into an editor, if you want. It's really integrated development environment, but it's an editor that's specialized, and that's going to allow for good productivity in terms of writing code, but also compiling, executing, debugging, all in one. So it's really important for us. Then version control system, it's something that's rather interesting because it's the link that's between software devs and localization. That's where the interaction is going to be. And we're going to talk a lot about that actually. Then there are other tools like requirement, QA, maybe people have heard about Jira or TestLink or things like that, bug tracking, and collaboration. And Slack and MS Teams are some of the leading platforms around collaboration from our perspective. Zoom is there, or GoToMeeting, or some other things, but really fast interactions, quick interactions, short bursts of interactions, that's really important. So just to give you a sense, when you, let's say that you're writing an e-business kind of application and you have a search function that you are writing as part of the sprint, very fast you're going to write something in terms of a search engine on the back end, but on the front end, you're going to have a user interface that will have strings. And those strings are going to show like city or airport, check-in, check-out are part of labels on a UI. The traditional way for software devs to write those strings are to hard code them. And that's the way we think, I have to say. We don't think about translation at some point, it's going to be done by somebody else, or maybe never. We think about the functionality behind the search functionality and what it means. And so even here you have city or airport, that's hard-coded into the code. Whatever you do, you pass in French as a lookout, it will still say city or airport. Check-in, the same thing. And even the one just above, the one for search over and hotels, that's even worse because there's a concatenation. For those who know a little bit about internationalization, this is really not internationalized. What you want to do as for the subsequent part for the downstream localization is really externalize embedded strings into resource files and modify the code, reference them by keys. And so when the locale is passed in, you get the key, you get the French equivalent to the key that was in English. What it looks like is it's put into a resource files, all the text that is supposed to be in the UI or that's user facing. So it could also be emails or license agreements for that matter. But any resource files can be translated. The key value base is really for user interfaces in general. And so the value of the key is going to depend on the locale. And every programming language has its favorite type of resource file. For example, Java typically will use properties. It's not set in stone, by the way, but there is so much framework around it that it's so much easier to use properties when you write in Java. Or if you run in JavaScript, typically it's a lot easier to write JSON resource file. Or in C#, it can be regex, for example, and so on. And so here are an example of a resource file. So this is just context. Probably some of you know that by heart. For some of you, it's kind of familiar. But for the context, again, the key here is exam address 1. It's the same here in the English and the French files. But in English, the label that's going to be put on the UI is address info. And in French, it's going to be information. So the thing is that you have resource files, and then you have maybe translation management systems or other systems. And some of those resource files may be creative. Some companies have an interesting way of creating resource files that are specific to their own constraints and own engineering backgrounds. And so sometimes TMSs don't support those. So for example, here, JSON, for this particular TMS, I took a list of, it's called mentors. It has a list of files that are supported. And you see there are a lot of them. Most of them are files that are documents type of files. But the key value pairs resource files, there are a few in that green box here, and you can see JSON, properties, regex, and so on. You have to be also careful when you're at software and to not create too much outside of the standards, but as much as you can leverage in the standard form of what is supported by the industry at large, TMS being one example, the better for your organization. At HP, there used to be a saying that if you are not using a standard, it should be at least 3 times better in terms of whatever criteria you want to use. I want to go over this a little bit, version control systems, because as software engineers, what we do is we write code on our own PC, laptop, workstation, and then we collaborate. Already collaboration is part of our everyday life with other team members using a version control system. So it gets centralized in typically a web location. So actually some of the team members here, they are in Arizona, in California, in Canada, or in Colorado here. And we all collaborate on the same Git kind of repositories in our. And I want to emphasize a little bit of that because that's part of the issues around localization and software devs. Because that's the link between the two of them, there needs to be some understanding on both sides on what needs to happen. And so typically when you're a dev, there is the overall products that's delivered as, let's say, on master or develop, those are naming conventions. And then you create branches that are going to be a copy of the set of files that are already been developed, and you do some modification on those files, but it's independent from master or develop. I'm going to show you what it looks like here. This is an example I want to show later. It's called Rebel Outfitters, and it's that pretend web application. You cannot really buy 3PO. I just want to emphasize that. But it's the code that underpins this application here. So there's a master branch, and it has a set of directories like source and so on. And you can see that underneath there are files a little bit everywhere. But then if you go to, for example, dark side, you have the same type of directory structure. Maybe most of the files are the same, but some of them are not. And so as a software dev, as a team of software devs, you'll be able to contribute in that dark side branch without affecting master, the thing that's being actually deployed at some point, until the time that you want to merge back your changes into that branch. So that's kind of illustrated here. We have a feature, you develop your code, and at some point you move it up to the branches. So this is still context. I'm spending a little bit of time on this because I want to show you that it's not super simple either for devs. There is a lot of complexity to deal with, and that translates downstream into complexity for localization. The other thing that the software development industry is moving towards, or has moved towards for a long time now, actually, I've been in the industry for a long time, is Agile software development. So Agile software development, this is one image that's foundational for Scrum type of Agile development. And there are other methodologies, I'm going to say. This one uses a backlog of a set of features that need to be implemented at some point. And you choose, let's say, 2 or 3 features, depending on the plan for this particular sprint. Typically, it's a burst of software development that lasts from 1 to 3 weeks for this particular type of methodology. And so here you plan what you want to put in. Maybe you want to have a checkout, a search functionality, and something else. Put that in the plan, and then as part of the sprint, you're going to do a full cycle of development so that when you launch, you have a demonstrable system that is going to have that checkout and search functionality ready to go. And so that burst here really has design. You need to design how that search is going to integrate itself into a framework, what it's going to look like, what kind of framework it's going to use underneath, and so on. And then you build it, meaning you write the code, and then you, at the same time, you debug. Then you have a test kind of period, a review, and then you launch. And that here, according to that methodology, you really should be ready to go pretty much, maybe even deploy it for customers. The thing is that because those bursts can be pretty quick, and actually some methods for Agile call for one feature being developed can be pushed out right away. Meaning in Kanban, maybe you have just the search, you do it, you actually deploy it right away. So it can be really fast. How does localization happen here? It's kind of a stepchild, and maybe redheaded stepchild. I can say that my son is redheaded, by the way. What happens is that it kind of doesn't quite fit into it because of how much time localization, translation in particular, needs to take in order to fit into that model. I'm going to talk about that just later on. But our goal is to make, as you build your resource files, like we were showing earlier, the key value pairs, as you build them, what we want to do is have translation right away, within minutes actually in the build. And when you test, what we want is localization testing and post-editing as part of this cycle here, of this ever-going cycle. And when you review, the review is done not just in English, but it's done in the target locales that you're addressing for your market. So maybe some of the target locales are Russian and French and Spanish and Chinese. we want to be able for the review to happen here also. And so when you launch with an application whose features have been developed correctly by design, but also the localization is part of it and not outside of it. One of the compounding factors is that that repository that I showed you earlier, this guy here is just part of one repository. The reality is that there are a lot of repositories here. Those are repositories that we have, there are a bunch of them, and each one has many branches. And so when you think about each one of those trains, it's a team that collaborates on one branch of one repository to make a product happen, make a set of product happen. And so there is a lot that goes on in software industries. For us, so Zoom is kind of nice, but you have to talk to people, and we are introverts. So having to type a text is really nice, especially emails is nice, but really Slack or Teams, those are the ways that we interact with each other. So for example, somebody in Arizona that I need to interact with is going to be a quick text, and she's going to send me something back right away, for example. So I'm going to go back with localization and collaboration at the end, but I just wanted to start prefacing this. And also, typically software development teams, there are maybe in San Fran, in Paris, in Sydney, in India or in China, and they need to all collaborate together. And so for the software industry, that's a need, actually. All right, so what are the typical processes that people put in place when they have software development happens and they collaborate and they push resource file into a repository, like I showed earlier with GitHub? The software devs are going to write the code, and they're going to write resource files like a JSON file or a properties file, and push that here. And what needs to happen is typically without any real tooling on this side, there will be somebody from dev, somebody from localization, some program manager involved into, okay, it's time to get the files from the repository to analyze what files have been modified, to check that the files do correspond to a good format, to put those into a way to send them over to translation, to track those. And so this is, by the way, a diagram that was provided by somebody that we did a talk together. That's what they had before automation. And when that person was away, the translation could not happen for that particular project. I tell you that this can get pretty complicated. So typically it's a set of manual steps and scripts, and it really implies paying time and resources in order to do this. And at that point, they can send that to an LSP, to a language service provider, and maybe it goes into a TMS, so there's an onboarding that happens here, and there's a workflow. Pretty much those are days. And in terms of the cycles that we're talking about for sprints, you can see that those are pretty tight. So when you have days that accumulate and you have resources, maybe the French guy is not available now for whatever reason, he's doing some other translation for another company, that availability is also part of the mix. The availability of the folks here, if there are manual steps, that's part of the mix. So all that creates friction and tension between software devs that need to do things quickly and the rest of the downstream processes for localization. So the first thing is automating the part that goes from the repositories to the translators. So for that, we have a product called LRM, but what I want to emphasize is that you use our product or something else. You want to really automate that integration from software development to the translation. For us, the way it's conjugated, I'm going to say, is from the repository, we listen based on some events, like the fact that the developer has pushed that file over. We listen to that. And we analyze the files for that repo. If any of the files automatically, they are checked with a number of 45 checks. And if everything is good, then it creates a project automatically in the TMS. And so that process, that takes minutes, not days. There are still days in terms of the translation side, but it's minutes here. So we're starting to reduce the time frame from the time that software dev has created resource file here in English, and the time that at least those files have been moved to the translation team. And that's already one progress. However, what we want is, we want to do better. So what we want is, as soon as a software dev creates a resource file, we want to automatically check which resource files have been created, if they are good again. Let's move them right away to an empty engine. Let's get them right away back into the automation. Let's check them, because we don't want to push files that are bad for software devs. And then we're going to push the translated files in the repo. And that, instead of taking days, we want it to take minutes. And that's the basis for the demo I'm going to do now. So pretty much here, I'm going to go back to GitHub here. I'm going to go back to Rebel Outfitters. And I want to pick a branch that's called Systren. You may guess as to why it's called Systren. And in that particular repository, you see that there is a Lingoport directory, there are source, and under source, what the software devs have done is they created an ENUS directory under which there is a string.json. So here is a resource file with key value pairs. So you see 3PO ambassador, you see description, there are key value pairs here like welcome to Rebel Outfitters. And if you go here, this is the Systren branch that was deployed. And you see home has welcome to Rebel Outfitters, 3PO ambassador. And so I'm gonna run what, if it were onboarded right away, whenever you push that, what's gonna happen? So to run that, I'm just gonna click that button here. In reality, what would happen is that this would be triggered based on the fact that the software devs has done a push of a file. So here we go, we're gonna do this. And it's going to trigger a set of processes that correspond to what we talked about earlier, to the fact that there are files that are somewhere under an ENUS directory and that are JSON files, and that those JSON files have key value pairs. So if we go back to this here, this is what's happening right now. The system is going and exploring the repository for new files. If there are any new files, going to send them to, in this instance, Systren, and it's going to send them to be translated into French. I just speak French. Since I'm French, I know that language a little bit better than others. And so what will happen is that it will be returned here and then pushed back there. And that's really one of the first keys here that we're going to talk about. The second part, I'm going to talk about that a little later. The second part is machine translation may be something that works really well, but there may be instances where the MT is not quite right. And so we're calling this in-context QA. It's really post-edit and QA. It can serve two purposes. And what we want is when the application is running, change it to the locale. So I'll change it in French later on. And in French, make the post-edit directly in the application, and that will correspond to that part right here. So what we're doing right now is this part here. The software devs have created some files. It's being translated as they are creating them, so it's pretty much always on. And after that, we're going to do the localization and the post-edit as part of the test, and potentially also a post-edit as part of the review. And that can be done in different organizations will have different ways of doing that, different ways of distributing the work, maybe via more of a QA group or more of a linguistic group. There are a lot of ways to do that. I'm going to go back here, and you see FRFR is back. It was already back a minute ago. I talked already too much. And what you're seeing here is that it was translated from Systren directly. And you see the key value pairs are here. And let's see. Welcome to Rebel Outfitters is now Bienvenue chez Rebel Outfitters. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to shift to the locale for French. And it's going to pick up these guys. See, Bienvenue chez Rebel Outfitters, it's right here. So in terms of a software dev, the nice thing about this is as soon as I'm writing code, I have all the artifacts that are necessary to deploy my application pretty much right away. I mean, it may not take as little as what I've done here if you have a lot of files that are new in a sprint, and that need to be translated right away. Typically, when you create an application, let's say you're going over to that part here, maybe you're going to create this feature, and so there will be few strings, and it's going to be really fast. So the interesting part here is that for those French speakers, maison, that's really where you live. It's not the home page, it's your house. So the home was translated from the basic System kind of engine to be maison as opposed to. So here, in terms of once you're done with your functional aspects and you've debugged your application as a developer, what you want to do is then pass it over to the QA group and the linguistic group in that instance, because the languages are already back, right? So maison here, in terms of a linguist, now I'm in Paris somewhere maybe, or I'm an LSP who is dedicated to this particular application. And what I want to do is I want to change a couple of things here because this really should be different. So here is a potential way of doing that. And for us, we want to have something where you don't even need to know TMSs, you don't need to know GitHub, what's a repo, what's a JSON file, what is a JSON file. What I want to do though is that maison is not right, so I want to correct that. And the way I want to correct it is I want to be accueil, which is it may not sound like the way it's spelled, but I promise you that's the way it sounds. And droid here should have droid with an E at the end. I'm not going to do the tréma. And so what you're seeing here is that there's a Chrome extension where it builds the list of things that you are in effect post-editing. So if you are okay with that, you can send it to the system. If you're not, you can delete it. For me, I'm just going to send them over. And that's what I'm going to do, continue. And so at that point, there is an event that's being sent to the system. And that's going to take into account the fact that those two strings have been modified for this particular deployment. So this is typically more of a linguistic QA type of deployment here. And I don't want it to be modified in master. I don't want it to be modified in IQA, in this one. I want it to be modified in System. I don't want it to be modified in a file that's somewhere over here. I want it to be in the French file. I want it to be here. And I don't want any keys. I want the key where it said maison before. That exact key, not just the fact that it's maison, right? So this whole system here is now going on here. You can see that over there. It says process requests. And so we are, in terms of the build was done, functionally it was good, it was passed over to QA. And now as part of QA, you can now add linguistic QA or post-edit, whichever you want to say, but it can be part of a quick sprint. And Jeff earlier in the talk just before was talking about his also goal to reduce that time frame between the time that you create something and the time that is good and it's back and it's good. So not only is it empty, but it's also post-edited. So at some point, this will be finished, and I'm going to check that. And if I go into FR, you're seeing that 1 minute ago, there was a linguistic post-edit LQA from Olivier Libouban at Lingoport.com. That's me. And I'm going to click on this, and I'm going to click the history here. And in GitHub here, just to give you a sense, you can see the differences, the before and the after. And so you can see that it is in the System branch. It is in the right directory, the right everything. And what was before this key that was droid is now with an E. That key that was maison is now accueil. And so at that point, you can redeploy. So let's see if it already redeployed. Here it is, maison. I'm going to refresh. And now it's turned into accueil. This is real, by the way. This is the real thing. And droid is with an E. And so typically what will happen also is that you may have a first pass at the entire application, go through all the pages and verify. But most likely you're going to be focusing on one part of the application where it's just developed. So maybe you're on the checkout page, for example. Maybe you are here and you want to see the checkout. And so maybe that part is the part that you want to review and where you're going to direct your linguistic reviewers. So what I wanted to show is one question that Bryan had also previously was, do we think that the industry is going to go more toward continuous localization? Absolutely, I really believe that. And our effort are to go that way at Lingoport in different tags, actually. A lot of things that I'm not talking about today that are also helping here. I'm going to go back to the presentation here. And so what we did is we did that part. You saw that the French was returned, and then we did the LQA. Machine translation really has been gaining a lot in terms of quality in the last 5 years, especially in the last 2 years, actually. And this is, so we plug in with different MT engines. This is from Systren, because I was using Systren here for the demo. That's the same for a lot of those MT providers. Quality is really getting to be really good. The speed also, I don't know if you saw, but that file was translated pretty much immediately. And also the breadth of combination between, for example, English and a set of target locales, or French and a set of target locales. That also is part of it. Now, as you've seen, home was translated into maison, and it was the generic way that Systren is doing it. However, there are customization that you can do. And those are two examples of customization. For Amazon Translate, for example, you can start, and LSP typically would be doing that with creating a custom terminology, either exporting from an existing translation memory, for example, into TMX, for example, and creating that custom terminology so that for my Star Wars, I think it is, for my 3PO buying, home is not going to be a house. It's going to be, for my UI, it's going to be my homepage. Everything is going to be related to my domain. And so that custom terminology is going to be much more precise. And that raises the level of quality tremendously, actually. Systren also does things like you feed the corpus, again, maybe with some set of key value pairs for a language, to do a neural MT training whereby your score, the quality of the translation is going to increase again. You can also do TM import or client dictionaries. So there are a lot of ways to customize. So there is the generic aspect, there is the customization aspect. Just on the generic side, I just want to emphasize that going from statistical to neural has been a big progress here. So, Bryan?
Yeah, I'm here. I'm here. You have a couple of minutes. I just wanted to come in and try and let you know
that's
that.
Good, because I tend to talk a lot, so that's great. Thank you. So for those who are French speakers here, you notice that La Fédération Internationale de Lutte is not exactly the International Confederation of Conflict. It's more the International Wrestling Federation. And that's the type of progress. If you look at that slide later on, you will see all the differences that have been accomplished out of the box. This is not with any customization, from a statistical MT to a neural MT from 2018 to 2020, and how good MT has become. And that's why we feel pretty comfortable with having MT right away coming back to the devs and having those files then reviewed. I'm just going to go very briefly then, because I can tell that you want to start moving on with collaboration. We also, our world is really in Slack. There are other teams are in MS Teams, but I interact with my team members, and software devs interact between themselves. Very brief messages about something very specific. And so we want to invite localization as part of those channels. And what we have here is, you can see that translation status for a particular project on a branch. You can see French, German, Spanish, the exact percentage of completion that you have directly from within Slack. And so you're augmenting the collaboration in between team members by adding the collaboration directly with the status of translation for your project as a software dev. think that's about it, Brian.
Thank you very much. I actually just wanted to get to questions because people obviously found this very interesting, and so did I. I mean, with my
Great.
background as a
Thank you.
programmer analyst, I followed right along, so I'm good.
Excellent.
So I think that obviously one of the questions that people were interested in, is there a way in Lingoport, for example, to retrieve or to find a given string based on context, whether it's ID or what have you?
So what I was showing earlier, that context is exactly that.
Okay.
So in the application itself, when you're here,
Mm-hmm.
that string is I'm not showing everything that we do under the
Of
hood,
course.
but that exact string does correspond to the key value that's in the directory, that's in the repository, that's in the string.json file. That's exactly that one. It's not another one.
Excellent.
So there is a direct link. It's more than in context. It's in application, actually. You are directly in the application that's running. That was just hot from the oven as the developer just pushed it out to QA pretty much. It's right there.
That's super powerful. Thank you so much on that.
Thanks.
One question was actually a general question about Lingoport as a company. Can you tell us how big the company is and how long you've been around?
We've been around. Oh boy, that's a question for Adam.
It is.
I'm just the VP of Dev here, probably since 2001, I think, and we
Okay.
serve major companies like I want to say I don't know who I can say and who I cannot say, but major companies that.
Okay, excellent. So fairly large company, been around for quite a long time. Let's put it that way. Fantastic. All right. So in respect to the presentation, I really want to thank you.
Oh, you're
I
welcome.
think it was super clear. I mean, even the non-tech people, I think, can follow along. The couple of comments I saw go by, which I totally agree with, is that there's so much from the IT, industry or initiatives that we can take away from in other industries and apply. And
Yeah.
if I turn that to myself, for example, just the education in terms of the programmer analyst education that I received or obtained has affected every I guess notion of analysis or everything else in the way I proceed in my day to day. So I think that applying this to localization, internationalization, globalization, what have you, I
Right.
think
Exactly.
is phenomenal. So I think it also provided a lot of clarity, as people were saying, to the overall process. So I want to thank you. I think it's great. Everyone, we're going to start a poll in a few moments, if it hasn't already started. So we'll be able to give feedback. And Olivier, merci. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Merci, Brian. I really enjoyed this format, by the way. For an introvert, this is perfect. It's like I don't have to meet people and say hi. This is great.
Fantastic. So again, thank you.